Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look into how technology is changing our lives. In the second half of our show, we'll talk to Christopher Koopman from the Mercatus Center about the rapidly growing sharing economy. Up first, Brad Templeton, Internet software pioneer and chair of networks and computers at Singularity University, joins us to talk about the challenge of developing driverless cars. Brad, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here.
Brad, you've been on the cutting edge of technology across your entire career. Would it be fair these days to call you an autonomous vehicle evangelist?
We haven't figured out what term to use, but yes, I would say that's a good description. I've been working on those vehicles with a number of different companies, and I really think they're going to change the world.
You remind people who are nervous about the potential dangers of having computers drive their cars that we've all become pretty complacent about the proven dangers of having humans drive cars. Spend a little time reminding us about that.
Well, it's actually pretty disturbing how blind we become to it. So around the world every year, 1.2 million people are killed in car accidents. In the United States, that number is now about 33,000. One way to express that is to realize that more people have been killed in car accidents in the U.S. history than in all the wars going back to the American Revolution.
Wow.
Compared to all the other problems that we worry about, other than maybe heart disease and smoking, this is the biggest killer. But it's also true that cars are a huge part of our commercial life, our personal life. They take up half the land in many of our cities. We use a quarter of our energy on cars. And your favorite topic, we also generate a quarter of our greenhouse gases from cars.
You know, it's a cost-benefit analysis, but we've seemed to become inured to the deaths when there are technologies that can reduce that. You've stated, kind of weirdly, you've stated that people are more willing to be killed by drunks than be killed by robots. Why is that?
It's a sad truth. Well, we have a fear of being harmed by machines, and it's understandable why we have that fear, and we like being in control of our lives. We don't like being out of control. So we're sort of used to and more willing to accept negligent humans causing all this carnage. And a smaller amount of carnage that's caused by machines, we have an emotional reaction to it.
Can our legal systems learn to deal with that?
It's an interesting challenge, and every country has a different legal system. Some have very little liability for car accidents. They just patch you up no matter what. And some, of course, have a very complex tort system. But it's actually a car accident is the most common tort there is in the world by a giant margin, not usually put into the courts, so we've managed to deal with it before.
So when we look at the range of new technologies being introduced in many different industries, there's an idea called the Precautionary Principle that's arisen in Europe, which is that no new technology should be let loose until it's absolutely proven safe in every different condition. They've certainly been that way about GMO foods. What makes you think they're not going to be that way about self-driving cars?
Well, they might be, but I think they won't be, because this is a technology to make something that we already have, and which is very dangerous, to make that safer. I mean, after all, those numbers I told you might spell out that the car is the second most dangerous consumer product that's allowed to be sold today. To be the most dangerous one, you'd have to light it on fire and breathe the smoke into your lungs. So, if you're talking about this really carnage-causing product and technologies that can make it safer and reduce that toll, the precautionary principle doesn't make that much sense. Instead, what makes sense is how quickly can we bring the death toll down?
Much of the debate on self-driving cars is framed as an all-or-nothing proposition. Shouldn't we be thinking instead about increasingly sophisticated computer driving assistance?
Well, we're not thinking about that. That's been going on for some time. And in fact, one reason that car accidents and deaths are on the way down right now is that we have gotten better at building cars and making them safer, partly with electronics and partly with airbags and crumple zones and so on. And all of these technologies were developed by the car companies and put onto the market and saved lives. The regulation actually came later, often decades later, when, in fact, the regulation typically started saying, you know what, these airbags are such a good idea, everybody should put them in, rather than saying too much about how to do it. So we've been building, and I shouldn't say we, but I'd say the car companies have been putting in products that will hit the brakes for you if you're about to hit somebody or another car, products that will keep you in your lane, that will keep your speed the same as the car in front of you. Those are all out there and have been for many years.
You know, we recently were traveling in Europe. We rented a spanking brand new Mercedes, and it was pretty impressive what this car was trying to do. I didn't realize it until I'm driving along, and it's behaving differently. It was pretty easy to get used to it.
Well, the systems that are out there now don't try and get in too much of the loop. They don't do the driving for you. There are some that will warn you or even wiggle the steering wheel if you're trying to make a lane change when there's somebody in your blind spot. There are the ones that hit the brakes for you, but they only do so when you're about to do something really, really stupid. So you shouldn't run into what they do too much, and that's a good way to start.
Well, take us through the technology a little bit. Start with the most advanced stuff on the commercial market and bring us up to date, because not everybody has a new car, and then leap forward to what's going on at places like Google.
So the variety of technologies are sold under the blanket name of ADAS, which means Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, and that includes facilities like adaptive cruise control that will handle the gas and brakes for you as you keep a constant distance behind the cars in front of you. It includes lane keeping that will keep you in your lane, the blind spot assistance that we just talked about. It includes traffic jam assist that's in the 2014 and 2015 Mercedes vehicles, which will actually do both the steering and the gas and brakes when you're at low speed in a traffic jam, and then you have to take the wheel again when the traffic jam breaks out.
And then there's self-parking.
Yes, there are also vehicles that will park themselves. Parallel parking was the first sort of thing that came out, but since then we've also seen some offerings to park the car in your garage if it's too far from your front door. Things that will measure a parking space and tell you whether you'll fit into it before you try and get into it. And some demos of more advanced parking systems to do things like find a space in a parking lot and park in it in a closed parking lot. Now, that's not commercially on the market yet, but it's getting closer.
So that's the evolution of the technology. Talk to us about the revolution. If we jumped ahead 20 years, what can a car do?
Well, and this is actually a very important and hotly debated question right now, is there an evolutionary path from the things on the market today towards that future, or is it a completely different path? I'm in the camp that thinks it's a completely different path, but the car companies are taking a different tack. However, that product of the future, the brass ring, is a vehicle that can operate fully safely and without anybody in it at all. So unmanned operation, and it can go down not just highways, but ordinary city streets and eventually just about every driving environment. And Google has committed itself to this, and their current third-generation prototype does not even have a steering wheel or pedals in it.
Oh my God.
So it's not meant for a person to drive.
Wow, so someday my Uber is going to come and there's going to be no driver behind the wheel?
Well, Uber is actually a pretty good lesson as to how this might work. Yeah, you're going to pick up your cell phone, and you're going to say you want to ride, and in a very short amount of time, something's going to pull up. And it's going to be a vehicle that might even be geared to the trip that you are about to take and the number of people who are traveling. And it's going to take you where you want to go. And then you're going to get out, and it's going to worry about parking itself and refueling itself and all the other vagaries and maintaining itself. You'll just get the transportation you want.
So, Brad, talk to us a little bit about the interaction between self-driving vehicles and pedestrians, particularly aggressive pedestrians like you might find in places like Manhattan. And could an autonomous vehicle really make its way across town when every New Yorker knows it's safe to step in front of it because it'll stop?
It's an interesting question. We're obviously going to try and figure that out, and I don't even know if we'll figure out the solution until we've actually seen this happen. Now, you're right. The people who program these are definitely going to program them to not be like, say, some New York drivers who might keep coming and try and play chicken with you.
It's not some. If you're driving across town in New York, you have to play chicken with pedestrians. Look them in the eye, and they got to stop.
Well, if that's the case, it's going to be a challenge. Playing chicken with other cars is a much easier thing to do because the worst thing that happens is a few dents in the fender. But obviously, hurting a pedestrian is something you'd like to avoid, even if you're entirely in the right. Now, one way you might do that is that if someone's riding in one of these cars and suddenly they spill their coffee because a pedestrian darts in front of the vehicle when they weren't allowed to, I might be quite annoyed, and I might take the video that my car took of that and send off a complaint to the police. And they won't do anything about it the first time someone does it, but maybe the 20th time they do it, they'd actually get a jaywalking ticket. I know that's kind of a very radical idea to think about in Manhattan. I don't know if this is what would happen, but it's one potential direction you might use to address a problem like that.
So, Brad, earlier you mentioned that you thought it was going to be more likely a revolution than an evolution in the autonomous vehicle industry. Do the existing legacy car companies have what it takes to build the car of the future?
It's a really challenging question for them. One way I express this is I say that the car companies are basically taking a car, which is what they've always built, and adding a computer to it to drive it. And the non-car companies, which include people like Google and a variety of other projects around the world, they're taking a computer and they're sticking wheels underneath it. Now, that's the same thing, but it's two different styles of development, two different styles of innovation, and I think two very different paces of innovation, which is the challenge. car companies have got a century, in most cases, of building cars and selling cars the way they have. And there are many people inside these car companies who know that the future is changing, but it's one thing for a few people to know and for a giant company to make a 90-degree turn.
Right. I've several times in my career tried to introduce advanced technology to automotive companies, and it was the most frustrating thing I've ever done. In fact, there's some great stories about Intel failing at that way back at the early days of that business.
It's common for all big companies, and it's the newer companies, the founder-led companies, which tend to have the vision and be able to make these changes. Now, on the other hand, it's one thing that everyone should owe a debt of gratitude to Google for, is it lit a fire under all of these car companies. They all had projects going on, but when it was announced that Google was working on it, and the press started saying, oh, look, the car of the future is coming from a non-car company, this got the car companies very disturbed, and they immediately started putting bigger budgets behind their own projects to make things happen. And competition is good for everybody.
You know, it used to be a rumor, but now it's been confirmed that even Apple is working on autonomous vehicles. Apple is no longer a founder-led company. Do they have what it takes?
It's also an interesting question. Google has this rare advantage of being a large company that is still founder-led. And Apple is going through a transition now, and everyone is asking that question not about cars, but of course about their phone and watch and other products. Nonetheless, a lot of very smart people inside Apple, a lot of people with a great design vision. Steve Jobs, he didn't do everything at Apple. I think we, in spite of the respect we should have for him, many, many people were responsible for those successes. And so if they can keep that up, I would hope to see a good offering from Apple. Apple, of course, is a very secretive company, and so they don't say anything really at all about what's going on.
Sure.
But we'll have to speculate for a while until we actually see what they're doing.
So, Brad, my wife has a 2-year-old E-Class Mercedes. It is absolutely the finest car I've ever driven. Everything about it is wonderful, except for the software. Just trying to input an address into the GPS is the most hideously frustrating experience. And you do it once and you still can't remember how you did it. How come they can't improve?
I must admit I'm also a little bit frustrated by the software design in a lot of cars. And that's one of the things actually people have liked about Tesla. There are two jokes about the Tesla. One is that it's a battery wrapped in a car, but the other is that it's a computer wrapped in a car, and that's the style of thinking they had in putting it together. And so these more innovative startup companies, Tesla's a little past startup, but young companies, I think, have a better chance at doing that. But I'll tell you where I think the interface is actually going to go, and this is something that frustrates the car companies a great deal, which is we're already carrying something very smart in our pockets that we know how to use. That's where our infotainment system is today. That's where our navigation system is today. It's not in the car. And the phone is replaced every 2 years, unlike the car or almost anything else in the world. And it's designed very frequently, and the software on it is updated all the time. So anything that's done in phones is going to win over something that's not done in phones. The car companies have been dragged kicking and screaming into realizing that. Only now are they understanding that they should release interfaces so that your phone can take over the screen of your car and really be in control of what's going on.
So is it possible that the legacy manufacturers could build automotive platforms that are brainless, and then you have to bring your own brain that you bought from Apple or Google?
I don't know if we'll get quite that far because the safety demands here are extreme. I mean, we really have to build something that's very, very safe. And that means that people will only sell what they've tested and put together. And so it's not really going to be that easy for people to slap together a bunch of different things that have never been slapped together before. The people who make it and sell it and certify it will have wanted to test exactly what they sold to you.
So, Brad, you've made the statement that one day we'll stop using mass transit because it consumes too much energy compared to well-designed fleets of self-driving cars. Please explain that.
It's a pretty dramatic thing, and the reason is that most of the mass transit systems in the United States are quite energy efficient during rush hour when they're packed full of people. But in order to operate, they have to run all day and they have to run in the other directions. And as such, their average loads are much lower than people imagine, and so they end up using a lot more energy than you'd think. So it turns out that vehicles meant for individual trips, small electric vehicles meant for one person, can actually be dramatically more energy efficient than that. And that surprises people. It's even more efficient, in fact, than the Japanese trains. Forget the pretty terrible American trains. Now, we are some distance away from moving around in small single-person electric vehicles. We have to, of course, get the safety at a level where we're going to be willing to ride around in a lightweight vehicle like that. But the one thing that makes a difference is today, the entire car industry is driven by one big question. It's what car do I need for my life? We go into car showrooms and we try and get a car that meets all of our needs. So we know we have SUVs outselling sedans, and we have the Ford F-150 as the number one vehicle in America because people want something to do everything, even though they don't need a pickup truck every day and they don't need an SUV every day. When you have mobility on demand, something more like Uber, where you summon it with your cell phone, suddenly what can be sent to you is the right vehicle for the trip you're taking. And so if you're alone and you're going across town, and by the way, that's 80% of the trips we take,
Right.
you might get a very small, lightweight vehicle. And so you could actually beat transit for energy efficiency. There are still some concerns about exactly how to make the best use of the road space. So I believe the right answer there is metering, whether it's using money to meter the roads or whether it's using allocation or lottery to meter the roads, if using money is politically unpopular, which it tends to be in the United States. But I think that together with those two things, we can build a transportation system that actually has more capacity and more energy efficiency than what we have today.
So, Brad, bring us up to date on the state of the law in the United States. If the Google self-driving car were to appear in showrooms tomorrow, would it be legal in 50 states?
Well, not in 50 states. Rather ironically, Google's made a large effort to get states to actually draft regulations. And there are 5 states in the District of Columbia which have done so, and many other states have laws under discussion. And those regulations actually now spell out a path to exactly how it becomes legal and how it becomes regulated. A counter-argument was that before those regulations were ever written, the United States is one of those countries, in theory, where if it's not forbidden, it's permitted. And the people who wrote the vehicle codes didn't think to write no robots when they were writing those vehicle codes. And so technically it's legal there. Now, the reality, as everyone knows, is if someone did put one of these in the showrooms, there'd be a large public, debate about it, I guess.
Yep.
And pretty quickly we'd see the regulators getting into the game and saying, no, you have to talk to us first. So it probably wasn't entirely unwise of Google to work that out in advance, although some of the regulatory discussion that's going on is not the way it should be. It's certainly too premature.
You know, anybody who's driven on the interstate highway system knows that if the speed limit says 65 and you drive 65, you're going to get blown away by the rest of the traffic. That 9 miles above the speed limit seems to be the preferred speed for most of the drivers and actually ends up being the safer speed for that reason. How can an autonomous vehicle be trained to break the law like that?
Well, so Google will tell you that their first 2-generation cars had a little knob in them, which let the occupant of the car set the speed, including setting it above the speed limit. And this is no different from your cruise control. Your cruise control doesn't beep at you if you try and set it to more than 65, right? So this put the decision in the hands of a human being, and of course a human being would take legal responsibility for that decision, one would hope. Now, a vehicle that's unmanned, however, wouldn't have a person inside it who could turn that dial, and so it could be a concern if they actually have to slow themselves down to a speed far below what people are driving. I actually think what they do in France is much smarter. There, the speed limit is 130 kilometers, about 81 miles an hour, and nobody goes over it. Well, I won't say nobody does, but it's much less common to go over it. And that's actually a pretty good thing, because the way we have it now, where everyone speeds, that gives you the rule of men versus the rule of law. The police can basically pull anyone over because everyone is violating the law, and they can basically just choose who they want to pull over. If you actually had a more realistic system, then the police could only pull you over if you were actually doing something that deserved attention, which I think would be better. Now, there's another very bizarre sort of math about this, which is to say that if we limit these vehicles to going the speed limit when everyone else who's driving manually is going faster, that would mean people were encouraged, if they were in a hurry, to turn off the automatic system, take the wheel themselves, and speed, which is actually a more dangerous thing for them to do than to allow the vehicle to go a little bit faster, even though the faster you go, of course, it's going to be a little more dangerous. But the human behind the wheel going faster is much more dangerous than the robot going faster. Whether we'll see the law become so rational about that is an entirely different question.
Well, rational laws are rare things in this country. If you think about the interaction between highway funding laws, the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, and how speed limits are set, it's a pretty weird history.
Yeah, politics obviously plays into this. The actual past history of automotive regulation hasn't been that bad. We mentioned earlier on that most of the regulation that's done of automobiles in the U.S. has happened after the fact. Manufacturers have developed safety products like airbags and seat belts and crumple zones and these forward collision warning systems and cruise control systems. They've developed them all. They've been out in the market for very long times, many years in some cases, before the regulations started to come down and specify that everyone should have this or how you should do it. It would be a big mistake to try and regulate too much of this technology before the people building it even know exactly what final form it will take. Certainly the regulators know that they don't know the final form. The regulators in California have been quite honest about that, actually. They say, we're not yet competent to really judge how this should happen, so we're trying to keep a reasonably light hand, and I hope other regulators are so enlightened.
You know, one of the other hats you wear is as a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and privacy is one of their issues. In the future world of autonomous electronic vehicles, where everything is data logged, recorded, and then you could imagine that there'd be regulations that all this gets uploaded to some central database searchable by the government, don't we lose all our privacy?
It is a concern. It's not quite as dramatic as you've paid out. The Nevada law, for example, only required that the vehicles, if there is an accident, that they have a record of whether they were in the self-driving mode for the last 30 seconds or not, just so you would know if the system were on or not. Certainly no requirement that the data be uploaded to any government access. Now, unfortunately, there's an engineering reason why this is likely to happen, which is to say that while these vehicles are being improved and tested, which is for many, many years to come, the people who are building them will be very keen to get records of what happened if anything goes wrong. And we want that too. We want them to be able to improve it. And the presence of those records does present a privacy threat. It also means, as Uber has already done, the elimination of the anonymous taxi ride or the anonymous trip, which we have today, unless we make special effort to preserve that. Now, the problem is that it's not number one on anybody's list to make that special effort. So it is worth talking about that. It is worth saying to people, try and preserve the private anonymous travel that we've had in the past when you make this new technology. There are ways to do it, but they're not easy and obvious.
You know, I recall a science fiction book, I don't remember the name, but it was a future city where everything was basically a flying Uber car. And people would call up these cars and go anywhere they wanted. But anytime the government wanted you, in this case of this book, it was usually for a dissident, they'd flip a switch and the car would take you right to the police station.
Yes, well, in the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, there's a scene exactly like that. They want Tom Cruise, and I actually mentioned this scene to people in my talks because he's sitting there having a video call, and suddenly his car says, you have a new destination. The new destination is your office. He's a police captain in the movie. So it's actually a very nice little user interface. It hasn't told him the new destination is the jail, but that's really where it's taking him. Now, when I ask people, do they want their car to betray them like this, everyone agrees they don't want that to happen. Unfortunately, you're right. The police might think that's a really handy feature. So we will also have to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Well, we've all gotten very used to our banks betraying us, so I guess we can get used to our cars betraying us.
Well, it's true. Our banks and a number of other companies are betraying us, but to be fair, there are a number of companies out there that do want to try and preserve things and do protect you against the government as much as they can. And we work with them. We actually at the EFF publish a list every year called Who's Got Your Back? And we rate the companies on how willing they are to protect you against subpoenas and warrants and other intrusions. And some companies definitely do better than others. And I hope that we'll continue to do this, and we'll do it about cars.
Well, Brad, it's been a pleasure to meet you. I'm going to have to start following your blog and your other writings. It's been delightful. Thanks for being on the show.
Great. Thanks very much.
That was Brad Templeton from Singularity University here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, we'll speak with Christopher Koopman from the Mercatus Center about how the emerging sharing economy is changing our lives. Stay tuned.